Hey YouTube, Gordon Miller here. So there are a couple of subjects that I'm going to touch on today that I promised that I actually wouldn't do anything on. But I'm going to do it anyway. This one is really about the impeachment process. And, it's interesting because it's made me take a closer look at just the justice system in general and understand that, if you take a look, the impeachment process where the House gets a chance to make its case, they can call witnesses, they can, spin the story however they want, is really kind of the same process that anybody goes through in terms of a grand jury process. The prosecutors get to present their case and they can have half-truths and innuendos as well as outright misinformation and lies that they're representing as fact. And they don't have to provide a great deal of evidence to support some of these claims. And these can all be refuted by the defense eventually at trial. But in order to receive an indictment, which, is the same thing as being impeached by the president or for the president, the prosecution gets to pretty much make its case to the grand jury unfettered by reality, unfettered by anybody being sworn in to tell the truth. And it really starts to bother me that unless you have the ability to be able to defend yourself, it's possible to receive an indictment for something that is completely not something that is a crime or that no crime has actually occurred. And so just like the president, in terms of they made this an issue with the impeachment, that ultimately the Senate determined that there was no crime. And if there's no crime, then there's no reason for a trial. And then there's, the process, which is basically the same thing as a trial. I mean, they basically threw it, basically it's a motion to dismiss and the Senate dismissed it. But it makes me take a look at the justice system in a whole different kind of light. For me, it's fairly easy to receive an indictment by the prosecution. They can put forth whatever evidence they want, and hopefully the grand jury, has a rational perspective on the information being presented. But there's no counterpoint. There's no swearing in. The witnesses aren't under oath. And the whole process, I think, is fundamentally broken. I think that there is a serious concern out there. And, the number of people that are incarcerated, and you look at the reality of what that's like. And, I think that it's very easy to see that the process can certainly get off the rails. Now, it's interesting to find out that the prosecution percentage, the successful prosecution percentage, is about 95%. So typically they don't go to trial unless they think they can win with the evidence that they have. And so that's an interesting perspective. But of course, there's 5% of those cases that they lose. And I think that aggressive and malicious prosecution is a reality. And I think that it inevitably results in situations where there are miscarriages of justice, where there is no crime, but a crime is alleged. And depending on how well you can defend yourself at trial, determines whether or not you end up being convicted. And I think that fundamentally, you look at the fact that the outcome of a situation for any given person is dependent on the nature of the prosecutor who receives the case and the nature of the judge or jury or even the grand jury in order to be able to determine how that process is going to unfold. And it's an interesting situation because if you have a very aggressive prosecutor and somebody who is either a judge or jury member that is understands that, well, this may be a perspective that they share with the prosecutor, then there is a different kind of alignment or perspective on the situation. So I'm just fine that I think that we have a serious, conviction problem anyway. And there are lots of people incarcerated that probably don't need to be incarcerated, not just for drug charges and things like that. I mean, misdemeanor drug possession, is being decriminalized all over the country. Eventually we'll end up, solving that problem as well. DUI folks are incarcerated as well, a bunch of other things like that. I mean, DUI and substance abuse and drug possession are horrible things, but I think that there are treatments for people like that I think would benefit people more than incarceration. But I think that looking at the reality of the way in which the justice system appears to operate, you have very malicious prosecutions that do go on by very aggressive prosecutors. That if you find a sympathetic judge or end up with sympathetic people on the jury, then I think you end up with potential miscarriages of justice, and people end up spending time in prison. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that the system itself, we saw it play out in real life in the impeachment trial, and that process is fundamentally broken. I think we can all agree that what we saw in the impeachment trial was a circus, and there's no going back from that. I mean, we've seen how that process plays out. The reality is that process is repeated daily all over the country for thousands of people who face similar types of prosecution. And I just think it's an important reality to kind of at least be intellectually honest about, that there are things that would never rise to the point of being a crime that unfortunately end up being prosecuted, and in some cases get a conviction. Whether or not you agree with Martha Stewart for her insider trading or a bunch of other different examples of things like that, if it's a crime, then fine. I mean, I get that. But I think that ultimately, in terms of intent and in terms of making sure that things like that receive the kind of attention that they need, and making sure that justice is fair and balanced, I just don't see that today that a lot of that is fair and balanced. I think that people have agendas and they have careers to build, and they build it on the back of convictions of potentially innocent people. And I don't think that that's anything that anybody should be happy about. I think we have some reforms in our justice system. We've seen the FBI receive admonishment for its role in some of these nefarious activities that resulted in malicious prosecutions and things like that. So, I think that, the entire justice system is currently under scrutiny for how that whole process works. And I, for one, think that it's important to do that kind of antiseptic investigation that leads to a better justice system for everybody.